Hi, Internet. Today is a highly anticipated moment for the community. We are going to create the Pseudo Liquids component from scratch with all the details. Welcome to this new TouchDesigner series, where I'll teach you how to create custom components. Part 1, Context. Before we start, I need to give you a bit of context. In the last 3 tutorials, I focused on using a single technique, exploring various ways to create visual universes with it. So in the first tutorial, I introduced the first custom component I made, which I call Pseudo Liquids. However, I think it's necessary to start a series of tutorials to explain in much more detail how I created this and the future components I will do. We are going to create the Pseudo Liquids from scratch, so you can follow the rest of the tutorials without any issues. Warning, this process will be a bit extended, and you will need to follow the steps very carefully. However, if you want to have this custom component immediately, I recommend you visiting my Patreon page. Part 2, Network. All right, let's get started. We're going to build the entire network from scratch, so don't worry about anything else at this moment. First, let's create 2 noise operators, add an input for the first noise. Now, let's move to the second noise and create the following network. Add an edge, followed by a blur, and then finish with a composite. Connect the output of noise 1 to the other input of the composite. Return to the second noise, create another composite, and connect the first composite you created with the new one. After the composite one, add a displace and connect both outputs to the inputs of the displace. After the displace, create another composite and connect the last 2 operators to it. Perfect. Continue with the following network. Switch the order of the operators. Add a displace after the last composite, followed by a blur, and then a level. Now, add a mirror and a switch to toggle the mirror effect on and off. Switch the order of the operators. Finally, end the network with an out operator. Okay, select all the tops, and in the Common tab, set the output resolution to parent panel size. Quick tip, if you click the bottom right corner of the operators, you can adjust their size to fit the new resolution, just to keep things tidy. However, this step is not necessary. All right, now let's create 2 channel operator networks. First, create a constant and add a math operator. Duplicate it and rename them to avoid confusion. Call the first math H-gain and the second math use the name harmonics. Next, we'll create another network in this section. This will allow us to switch between different pixel formats, or you can say color modes, which I'll explain later. Start by creating 2 constants and renaming them to RGBA and mono. Connect both operators to a switch and name it select color. Part 3. Mapping values. Let's start by mapping the values of the channel operators. Select the first math operator and copy the following values. Select the second math and copy these values. Next, we will map these values to the second noise as follows. Before mapping the next network, let me explain how we'll use the switch to select our pixel format. If you select the level and go to the Common tab, in the pixel format option, you have different color treatments that TouchDesigner can apply. We're interested in using 32-bit float RGBA and 32-bit float mono. You'll notice that each time we select one, TouchDesigner indicates an index that we can use to call any of these options. In this case, index 4 corresponds to 32-bit float RGBA and index 12 to 32-bit float mono. So we'll save these values in the 2 constants we created earlier. Then, map the switch to the pixel format. Alright, the next part might seem unnecessary and we could skip to the final part, but I believe it's important to test the entire network and ensure each part is working correctly. So that's what we'll do. First, select all the composite operators and use the operation difference. Then go to the constant and set this value. Select the second noise and copy these parameters. Ensuring the results match what you see on my screen. Go to the second noise and copy these parameters. We'll animate the noise with the classic script Abe's time.seconds. Divide by 10. Perfect. Select the edge and copy these parameters. Oops, my mistake. This should be a blur. I just realized I created a cache, so let's replace it with a blur. Very well. Copy the following parameters into the blur. Locate the first displace and copy these parameters. Select the second displace and copy these values. It looks incredible so far. Select the blur and copy these parameters. Finally, go to the level and copy these parameters. Everything looks perfect up to this point, but we have an unusual glitch. This is because we haven't set the pixel format in the first noise, which should be 32-bit float RGBA. Once corrected, our network will be ready for the next part. Before we continue, I want to remind you that with this component and a few simple techniques, I created all these VJ packs that you can find for free on my Patreon. I'll leave the link in the description. Part 4. Create a custom component. Select all the operators, right-click on an empty space, and choose the Collapse Selected option. Create an out to see what we're doing in the right panel. You can also visualize the composition within the same component by clicking on the circle. Right-click on the component and select Customize Component. A pop-up window will appear where we can create parameters to map to the operators inside this container. To make it more convenient for the next part, go to the left panel and select Network. Choose the container we created and we'll have the panel where we'll create our custom menu handy. Double-click on the component to enter the network because we will start mapping the values. Perfect. Let's start by creating the main pages to keep everything organized. Create the following pages. As you can see, our base panel is populated with these tabs where we will create buttons, menus, sections, etc. to manipulate the entire network. Next, we'll create the parameters. This part will be lengthy, but try to do it without missing a single parameter. Keep in mind while reviewing the tutorial that not all parameters are the same. We'll use integers, float numbers, menus, or toggles. Perfect. Now that we have all the parameters, we'll assign minimum and maximum ranges to each one. So copy each of the following instructions. Review that all ranges are correct before moving on to the final part. Part 5. Mapping the network. This last part also needs to be copied exactly as is. Of course, you can add or remove parameters, but the important thing is that you now have a clearer idea of how to do it. I hope that over time, you'll create new components and share them with the community. To make things easier, it's best to have all the panels somewhat independent. Now, copy the following mappings using the options Copy Parameters followed by Paste Bind. Okay, that was long, but it's worth having this pseudo liquid generator or whatever you want to call it. Ensure that all parameters work and that the numerical values we're using to manipulate the network are consistent. You may want to handle different ranges for some parameters, and since you use the paste bind option, you can change any parameter directly in the operators within the network without losing the original mappings. You'll notice that whether you change the values inside the network or directly from the containers panel. Before we continue, I want to show you a more advanced component that has 7 presets you can select with just one click. Remember, you can find it on my Patreon. You can choose from these 7 compositions. Part 6, Playing and Exploring. Here are 3 options to start exploring. 1. The most obvious, simply move the parameters. Try several combinations. 2. The second is more interesting, recursion. You can clone the container and connect the output to the input of a second container, letting the first manipulate the second. 3. You can use any other tops as input for the container, such as a noise or a movie file in with videos or images. Almost forgot, you can rename the component however you like. I called it Pseudo Liquid. To keep it handy in your library, just open the TouchDesigner palette, go to My Components, create a new folder, and drag it inside. You'll have it available for any project. Okay, this tutorial was not easy to make, and there will be many more like it because this channel has just started. So, I hope you happily subscribe and click the bell icon. I want to remind you that you can find this component in my shop on Patreon. Also, there is some free VJ packs and project files. See you in the next tutorial.